In this video, I'll be explaining a non-standard translation of a 4,050-year-old stela. After that, I'll share the conclusions I've drawn from this translation. The stela of the gatekeeper Maati is a 4,050-year-old Egyptian masterpiece from the Middle Kingdom period. It's owned by the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, who purchased it in 1914. It's believed to have originated from Luxor, Egypt. Its actual size is 59 centimeters long, 36.3 centimeters high, and it's on 8 centimeters thick limestone. The stela has been divided into 4 parts. The main illustration, which contains 2 separate parts, the horizontal margin at the top, and the 4 vertical margins at the side. The overall theme is atomic energy conversion. The main illustration contains the basic principles of the subject that must be understood before we can grasp the more sophisticated ideas being illustrated in the margins. The stela is meant to be read from the center out over, so we're starting with this menagerie of items, which I believe is how they've chosen to communicate the concept of everything or all things. The next item I want to discuss is the one comprising 3 concentric circles in the middle of everything. This is a depiction of an atom. So up to now the text reads, "All things are made of atoms." Before we move on to the next items, I want to remind you what the structure of a typical atom looks like. As you can see, atoms are composed of 3 types of subatomic particles: protons, neutrons, and electrons. The center of the atom is referred to as the nucleus. Protons and neutrons exist at the center of the atom, and because of this, they're sometimes referred to as nucleons. Electrons exist not at the nucleus, but in orbit around it. And now we're looking at the 3 circular items in the bottom right corner. These are depictions of the 3 subatomic particles that make up an atom. On the left, we can see the 2 nucleons, the proton and the neutron, which have slightly different marks at the center. And on the right, there's the electron, which exists not at the nucleus, but in orbit around it. So this part of the stela reads, "All things are made of atoms, and atoms are made of 3 types of subatomic particles." This part of the stela is illustrating what we call the thermoelectric effect. The thermoelectric effect is the creation of an electric potential by way of heating and creating a temperature differential on a thermocouple. A thermocouple is a device made from 2 different conductive materials that are joined together to form an electrical junction. When heat is applied to one end of the thermocouple, charged particles diffuse from the hot end to the cool end. This effect can be used to generate electricity. We see the entity known as Maati sitting with what appears to be a table in front of him. The table is a depiction of a thermocouple. You can see it's made from 2 different pieces of material that have been joined together. An electrical junction. You can see that the thermocouple is being heated at one end by a lantern on the floor. The objects on top of the table are forming what we call a heat sink. This increases the surface area of the thermocouple and makes it difficult for the heat from the lantern to reach the other end of the thermocouple. We now have a thermocouple with a temperature gradient, which gives us an electric potential. The vases or jars are symbolic of storage devices and are meant to represent batteries or capacitors. The thermoelectric effect is a linear process, meaning it can be arranged to work in either direction, i.e., it can be driven by heat to produce electricity, or it can be driven by electricity to produce heat, and it's a process that takes advantage of subatomic diffusion. Heat is a byproduct of this process, and we see Maati is warming his hands and feet. So, overall, the main illustration has provided us with an explanation of what atoms are and what they're composed of. It's then given us an example of how this knowledge can be used to generate electricity or heat. Now we'll take a look at the margins, where unfortunately some of the symbols still remain untranslated. The ones that I have translated, however, help us to guess what they're attempting to convey. Firstly, let's look at the top margin. These hieroglyphs are meant to be read right to left and top to bottom. I'm starting with the 6th hieroglyph from the left, which in my opinion is the most important one on the whole stela. As I've mentioned, we should read the hieroglyphs from right to left and from top to bottom, which means the first symbol we should read in this picture is the small circle in the top right, which is a depiction of a subatomic particle. The next symbol we read is the large semicircle on the bottom, which is a depiction of half an atom, and above it we see half a nucleus. This is an illustration of a neutron splitting an atom and its nucleus. It's also the first step of nuclear fission, which is exactly what I believe is being shown to us in these last 6 hieroglyphs. In the fission process, following the splitting of the first atom, a minuscule amount of energy is released. The picture seems to be of a flacon or a vial, which are things that contain samples or minuscule amounts of something. After the minuscule amount of energy is released, more neutrons are liberated and a chain reaction is initiated. This symbol could be perceived as a leg with a chain. The chain could also be perceived as a stream of particles. The liberated neutrons split more atoms, and there's a larger release of energy. The top symbol is representing a split atom, and where the flacon was being used to represent a small amount, the shape below the split atom is representing a larger amount. And again, more neutrons are released from the atoms that were split. The chain reaction continues. The sequence culminates with these 3 symbols. The top one is the symbol for electricity. The one in the bottom right corner is the symbol for a magnet. And the vertical rectangle is a symbol from the Sumerian language. The accepted translation for this symbol is beam, electricity, magnet, beam. Interestingly, the Sumerian name for Giza was also beam. To recap, the nuclear fission sequence in hieroglyphs. From right to left, a neutron splits an atom and its nucleus. A minuscule amount of energy is released. A chain reaction is initiated. More neutrons are liberated, which split more atoms, and there's a larger release of energy. Again, more neutrons are liberated. The chain reaction continues, and the final 3 could be read as electromagnetic beam, or they could be a reference to direct energy conversion, which is something that involves directing charged particles from a fission reaction through electric and magnetic fields to generate electricity. I suspect the symbols preceding the ones I've translated are related to the various front-end processes that must take place before fission is possible, namely, the uranium mining and refinement processes. Now we'll take a look at the vertical margins. This part has the most untranslated hieroglyphs, and as such I cannot say with certainty what's being communicated. However, from the parts that I've already translated, together with the few symbols I've been able to translate from this area, I can say that I suspect that these 4 columns are illustrating the nuclear fusion process. Starting from the top right of the vertical margins, let's look at the first 3 symbols together. These 3 symbols are illustrating a process called water electrolysis. Electrolysis is the process of using electricity to split water into hydrogen and oxygen. First, there's the symbol for a body of water. Then in the middle there's the symbol for electricity, which we identified at the end of the fission sequence. And at the bottom is a depiction of an electrode with a cathode and a anode at each end. When the cathode and anode are placed into water and connected to a DC supply, the anode will become positively charged and oxygen will be released from this area. At the same time, the cathode will become negatively charged, which will catalyze a release of hydrogen. Here is an example of how we illustrate this process in textbooks and science websites. The next hieroglyphs in the sequence are these 3. The authors have used birds as symbolic representations of gas. Illustrating an invisible gas is difficult enough, but these instructions require the illustration of several different types of gas, which complicates things even more. This is why I believe they chose to use birds, as they can now easily illustrate many different forms of the same thing. Birds could be described as creatures or a species of the air. In the author's day-to-day language, they might not have had separate words for air and gas. Therefore, there may have been a correlation between the word they used to describe gas and the word they used to describe birds. Also, in our language, gases are often referred to as different species of gas. I think the bird here is representing the hydrogen that's being released from the water. As well as the bird, we see a seated entity behind the bird. The entity could be perceived as sitting motionless in an attempt to capture the bird. Underneath the bird, we see an open hand, again looking as if it wants to catch the bird. So our previous hieroglyph was telling us to perform electrolysis, and this one is telling us to capture the hydrogen that is released. The next hieroglyphs in the sequence are these. The leg on the right is telling us to bear weight down upon something. This is the instruction to compress. Compress the gas that we've just captured. The symbolism of the leg as a means to compress would have been a familiar concept to the authors, as seen in this artwork from the same period. We see the winemaking process from beginning to the drinking and storage. And we also see them using their legs and feet to compress the grapes. The twirled shape in the middle is a depiction of a condenser. Condensers turn gas into liquid. This process, when carefully controlled, can also be used to separate hydrogen into its different isotopes. On the left of this set, there's a small circle with a half circle beneath it, and this is illustrating the separation process. As the hydrogen is being liquefied, it's also being separated into hydrogen 1 and heavy hydrogen. The atomic mass of heavy hydrogen is double that of hydrogen 1. Hence, the circular hieroglyph is double the mass of the semicircle beneath it. So this sequence is instructing us to compress, liquefy, and separate. The next hieroglyphs in the sequence are these. The symbol on the top consists of a large, rectangular mass with what appears to be a liquid drop rising upwards from it. Then beneath that we see a small square and a small semicircle. This is an illustration of the compressed liquefied gas starting to evaporate. And this process is called fractional evaporation. It's a process which is used to separate miscible liquids from one another and from any solid contaminants. So these symbols represent another stage of purification and refinement. In this context, the way it's being refined and purified is by removing any solids, represented by the small square, and hydrogen one represented here by the small semicircle. Once this stage has been completed, we should be left with a high purity heavy hydrogen, or deuterium, gas. The next hieroglyphs in the sequence are these. We see now that the bird they are using here is different to the one we started with. This one is bigger and heavier. This is what I believe they've used to symbolize deuterium gas. Just another name for deuterium is heavy hydrogen. This is what the basic refinement process described so far has produced. We've gone from water to hydrogen to heavy hydrogen. As I previously explained, the next two symbols I think are the magnet and the beam symbol. Then there's the eyeball hieroglyph, which I believe is the symbol for optics, and in this context it's being used to mean focus. So these four together are deuterium gas, magnetic field, beam, focus. I believe this is a description of a deuterium beam. Deuterium beams are produced by using magnetism to focus deuterium gas into a beam. And there's several pathways to achieving nuclear fusion. The simplest one is called inertial electrostatic confinement fusion. It involves using a deuterium beam to inject ions into the fuel chamber. This is where the continuous translation ends. There's some other symbols that I'll talk about in a moment, but first let me recap on what we've covered. From the top we have perform electrolysis, capture the gas, compress and liquefy the gas, evaporate the liquids to separate the hydrogen isotopes and to remove solid contaminants, generate a deuterium beam. An interesting sequence appears at the top of the second column. First, there's the heavy bird, symbolizing deuterium, then the symbol for optics, being used to mean focus. Then there's the symbol for beam, the vertical rectangle. The next one to read is the star symbol. I think this is representing plasma. Next to the plasma, there's the magnet symbol and three beam symbols. So these read as deuterium, focus, beam, plasma, magnet, beams. In the nuclear fusion process, one of the things deuterium beams are used for is heating plasma. The plasma is controlled using a method called magnetic confinement, which involves containing the plasma within strong magnetic fields. I think this set of hieroglyphs is representing that part of the process. Now I'm going to move to the final set of hieroglyphs in the four vertical columns, which appear to be illustrating the culmination of the fusion process. When the small semicircles are placed above the large semicircles, they represent an atom and atomic nuclei. So reading this top to bottom and right to left, this illustrates two atomic nuclei coming together, releasing energy and forming a single heavier nucleus. This brings me to the end of the translation video. Look out for part 2, in which I'll be sharing some of the conclusions I've drawn as a result of this.